Hi, I'm Kevin Murray. I'm curator of Make the World Again, the exhibition currently on at the Australian Tapestry workshop. And I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the Boonwurrung people as the traditional owners of the land upon which we're recording today. And I pay my respects to elders both past and present, and respect to any other Indigenous Australians who are watching us now. This is a time to talk about the ideas and works that are part of the exhibition. The exhibition originally came out in terms of a concept out of an invitation to put together an exhibition for Crafted Vancouver in Canada. And the idea was to think about what it is that makes Australian textiles particularly interesting in a global context. And this is at a time when the world was being torn apart politically, particularly by growing tribalism, make our country great again kind of rhetoric. And there was a sense that there will come a time, which we seem to be at now, where we try and put those different countries back together again. But who was to know that it would also coincide with the COVID pandemic and lockdown, and now this exhibition, this beautiful exhibition, well hung at the Australian Tapestry workshop in South Melbourne, is one that gives us a chance to see it and enjoy it here. And so I thought it'd be a good idea to have an opportunity to talk to the artists and very interesting anthropologist about the ideas and how they relate to their particular works. So I thought we could start with David Turnbull, who I've known for quite a while, a very interesting thinker. He's written a lot about maps and how we understand space and geography. Currently an Alfred Deakin Fellow, and somebody who maintains a great interest through conference papers and chapters in things archaeological. And I know, David, you've had an interest in the way in which we conceive of time and human civilization, where normally we look at things like the Stone Age as the beginning of civilization, but you say that we've often underestimated the degree to which fibre has played a role in the development of human civilization. Would that be true?
Yeah, I think that's essentially true. And I think we're at a particularly acute moment historically that you've already alluded to, that we are making the world again, but it's having trouble being born. If you remember Gramsci's Prison Notes, he says, the dead is dying, but the new is having trouble being born. And one of the reasons I think why that's difficult is the kind of Western epistemology which sees the world as divided into subjects and objects. You know, it's all out there, things, and it's about plans and hierarchies in that way of thinking about the world. If you take a different perspective, which is fundamentally a weaving perspective, you get a completely different understanding. If you look at the object, it's not an object, it's a process in action behind me. This is, as it were, the new network thinking where everything is interconnected. And that sense of a living cognitive system being the reality that we now ought to be able to embrace and recognize, we miss it because we are blind to what actually went on in the stories we tell ourselves about the origins of weaving and moving. Fundamentally, it's the story of moving, i.e. moving out of Africa. How could we have moved out of Africa? Well, you've probably all read Elizabeth Barber's book, Women's Work, came out in the 1980s, I think. Anyway, she says there wasn't a Neolithic revolution after we left Africa. There was a string revolution. As with string, we were able to move because we could carry our stuff and and our children. And that enabled us to occupy every eco-niche on the planet, making nets and snares. And that sense of the importance of string, I think, needs to be reviewed, because we now know it wasn't humans, it wasn't Homo sapiens that first made string. It was, in my view, Homo erectus and Neanderthals. We found braided string now in a cave in France. That's 130,000 years old. Obviously, string doesn't ordinarily survive, so it's a microscopic fragment. But if you look back further to Homo erectus left Africa 1 million years ago and made it into the Indonesian archipelago. Therefore, they went by sea at some point. And to go by sea, you had to join something together. And what this is really all about is joining things together. How do things connect? And they had to make a raft. To do that, you have to have a form of string, cordage, tying it together. But you also had to persuade somebody else to come with you. You can't do it on your own. So here's the origins of language, of rhythmic movement, and storytelling. The grass is definitely greener on the other side of the hill. I'm not about it. Follow me. And that's what weaving's fundamentally about. It's storytelling and connecting. But it isn't just that. It is, as it were, the way the world really works in terms of our interactions with it, with each other, and with the environment as we move through it. We weave our understanding of the world. The world isn't just out there and we just represent it in a mirror. We create the world in a co-production with all the entities in it.
Yes, it's a wonderful place to begin, thinking about that and revising our sense of I guess, humanity from something like the original scene in Space Odyssey with the weapons and very patriarchal kind of creation, cutting and destroying, whereas this is binding together. But one of the references in this show is to the way in which we've understood how the world was created, and the number of myths that see the world as being crafted in some way. Is it very common for the world to be seen as woven? Is that a common understanding of how the world came to be? Does it sort of naturally lend itself?
I think it naturally lends itself in virtually every culture you can see. The evidence, of course, is in the mythologies. That's one of the fundamental tropes. But in terms of string, for example, one of the commonest cultural forms are string figures. String figures produce shapes and spatiality, but you do it in conjunction with something else. It's essentially biological. And the real point of connecting string and stories and weaving, from my point of view, is that it's about tension. None of this works unless there's tension. Obviously, all of you as weavers know very well that you've got to get the tension right, otherwise it goes shit-show. But string doesn't work at all, it's useless unless it's in tension. But it's the same with stories. Stories are a way of ordering events in space and time according to a particular thesis you have about consistencies and patterns in the world. But at the same time, everybody who's listening, and all stories are dialogical. I've done things like that. Somebody said yesterday, don't you think it's different? And we have brought into a form of storytelling which is currently coming undone, but by and large, the Western epistemology dominates the narrative form about how all this is going to be, and it leaves out the essential point of that it's fundamentally bringing the world into being. But as you can see in this, it's actually occurring within science that what we're really dealing with is a living cognitive system. We are our interaction with our microbes, with each other, with the cosmos. It's a living cognitive system all the way through.
And even in that system, we find weaving not just something that humans do as well. In Garden magazine, with the issue from Chile, there's an interesting article about the Mapuche of southern Chile, and it's called the Daughters of yayin, which is the Mapuche word for spider, who are understood to be the weavers who've learnt to do this from spiders. And we had another article about spider women of the Navajo and how it was that the spider taught the Navajo the craft of hojo, which is how to make the world beautiful. So it's interesting to see that between species there's also this understanding that the weaving is making the world come to be in some way.
Indeed. And it's indeed the case with the Navajo weaving, that the notion of beauty depends on it being a mistake. That it isn't all totally consistent. I mean, that's an example of what's wrong with Western epistemology. They want to make everything consistent, all to one measure. And as soon as you do that, as soon as you try and commensurate everything to one standard measure, you lose the diversity, you lose the essential point that's expressed in these weavings. There are multiple ways of seeing the world and of understanding it. And if you insist that we all understand it according to one view, you will end up with a monoculture, which, as we all know, is fatal. It's terminal.
I wonder, Sara, if we could go to you, Sara Lindsay, who's one of our distinguished weavers. You've been working here at the Tapestry workshop. You had been for about 12 years, I think, and had a number of exhibitions, and you've also been travelling. You had a number of residencies, so this year's been a very different year for you. And we heard you speak about these works which reference flags, and I guess flags are forms of textile in a more modern context that have brought people together and allowed nations to come to be, and often highly fought over, such as, say, even the flags of rebellion, such as the Eureka Stockade. So in terms of making it kind of a personal flag, what does that mean for you? Is it a way of recognising something which doesn't fit within that system?
I think it certainly does, and I think, although I was, in a sense, an economic migrant, certainly not a refugee or asylum seeker, but nevertheless, that does create a sense of a certain kind of dislocation and wondering, quite where you fit in the world. I mean, many of us feel like this for all sorts of reasons, but I think that's something that developed through this work that I was investigating about the sort of so-called, in that time, I probably wouldn't do it quite the same way now, but the migrant state was that sense that you didn't have to be one or the other. You didn't have to be carrying the British flag or the Australian flag. And people wanted you to declare, do you feel Australian? Do you feel British? And I spent a lot of time in Japan. I've more recently been spending a lot of time in Portugal. And I feel incredibly fortunate to be able to do that. But I guess in some ways this using the gingham fabric, which was supporting my interest in the sort of sociological aspect of textiles. I mean, they've been made and worn since David would be more specific in terms of this particular time, and people have used fabric, weaving styles, clothing to mark their place in the world or mark their place in society. So in some ways I think this was marking, on a very individualistic way, a little bit of a sort of identikit for myself, that I didn't want to be labelled as British or Australian, or I wanted to be able to freely move throughout the world.
And it's interesting how you've chosen something like gingham, which is one of these kind of ubiquitous textiles that you wouldn't even look at twice, really. And it's a bit like your project around skirts, photographing of the hemline of skirts, that you do see textiles as being something which transcends national boundaries.
Absolutely. I mean, I think I'm just one of those people who, from a very early age, became excited by textiles, and it's sort of as simple as that, really. I love feeling textiles. I love the sense of whether they're rough or smooth, or they flow in the breeze, and certainly the skirt project was, in a sense, documenting the position of textiles kind of in the world, in movement. And then I've gone on to do a project more recently, a COVID-based project, where I've again used gingham, partly because I've got a house full of it still, that's holding up my house, but because it is a universally recognised fabric. So people, when you say, well, I'm doing this project with gingham, oh yes, well, I've got some of that in the rag bag. Or actually, although Portugal wasn't quite so easy, but Japan, probably 2 in 5 people will be out in the street wearing some form of gingham. So, and it's been used as, luckily I never wore it as a school uniform, because I think a lot of people will never go anywhere near gingham if they've had it as a school uniform. But I didn't. I had a rather pretty dress when I was 12 that was pink, and then I bought one for my daughter in Hobart that was black and white, and that it triggered a whole new body of work about memory and family, and then it was one particular work actually won a nice award in Japan, and they likened the gingham dress to the kimono that's been there for a long time and just continues on from generation to generation. I love that association.
Well, speaking of going between countries, Siri, I wonder if we could hear from you, Siri Hayes, who's a photographer in a textiles exhibition. And so I've known your work for many years, exhibited in galleries like the Centre for Contemporary Photography, and quite striking, sometimes large prints of landscape, which reveal something about our place in nature within the city, which have been very strong. And travel has been a very important part of your work as well. But in this case, you decided to, as well as making some work while you were travelling to Kanazawa, I believe you also wove a piece of textile, which is in the backdrop of the work in this exhibition along with the textile. So is it just purely coincidental that you have an interest in weaving, or do you feel as though there's a relationship between capturing an image on print and sitting at a loom and weaving?
Yeah, actually, I don't know if there is that much in common between photographs and weaving, but I started off at the Victorian College of the Arts as an 18-year-old and just completely mesmerised by the magic of what photography is. But all my life I've been around textiles. Both my mother and my grandmother have always knitted or made things, and I went to a Steiner school where there's a lot of handicrafts, and so it's something I always did, and it felt strange to sort of, I kind of had it in the back of my mind for a long time that maybe one day I could bring textiles into what I do. And I think possibly one of the main reasons is photography. There's so much distance between you and the subject and the light and everything. It's such a sort of ephemeral, or it's very hard. It's not tactile. It's not. You can't really put your finger on it. And I didn't. That was a part that I felt was always missing. So when it sort of made sense to bring textiles into my work, it was when we actually went as a family to Barcelona. We had a residency there. My husband's also an artist, and he's a ceramic artist. So that's how I know him. So I did the ceramics elective at the VCA, and it was like, great, I can get my hands dirty and get in amongst it. And yeah, I made a portrait of him, and I realised that it was the travel, being a tourist and being a parent and being an artist in an unfamiliar place. For me, I needed to be able to touch that into the work. So I started to sew stitches onto the photograph to give a sort of tactile sense of me and that place and the portrait of my husband, Paul. So I think, it was out of a need for that tactility. And I've been thinking about what you said, David, about this sense of making the world again. And I think it's really made sense for me, this paper, Brian Martin, academic, indigenous academic and artist, and I think it's in a lot of academic theory now about this sense of representation that comes with a Western way of thinking, and I feel like for me that's my problem with photography, is that it's a representation and it's not an actual necessarily always. It's a picture of something, but it's not the actual thing. And I think that's what I like about weaving, is it brings you to that thing a lot more when you're actually present with it. And I love Rebecca Solnit talking about the 19th century, how there was these inventions in the West. It was where everything started to travel much faster than the speed of the wind, and I thought it's always stayed with me. Photographs about being somewhere else, or train travel, going so fast through space that you can never actually be where you are in that space. And it's about getting somewhere else, and telegrams about being somewhere else again, posting some information to someone very quickly. So for me, I think there's this sort of unravelling of representation that I think is really important for our culture to go through and to be, maybe that's just from my own experience, but I sort of feel like that feels real to me at the moment, that's a really big need personally, and I think on a world scale.
And weaving, of course, is a relatively slow act compared to... obviously, a lot of work would go into Photoshop and so on, and touching up photos. We perhaps underestimate that. But what did it mean to you to put together the eucalyptus and the indigo dye?
I loved every element of that. So, I loved that when I was gathering those leaves beside the road, a friend rang me later on and said, I thought that was you in the ditch collecting leaves. I love it because it does actually, and that's where the magic comes in with, for me, in the botanical dyeing, is very similar to being in a dark room, is sort of, and I guess it's similar interest in what goes in a kiln and what comes out. There's a magic element that happens where you've got a sort of a bit of an idea of what might happen, but actually I think that sense of not being perfect about it and just going, we'll see what happens. And so, brewing up all of those leaves on the stove. I don't really cook much at our place, so Paul comes home and is very suspicious as soon as he sees a pot on the stove, and sure enough, it's generally leaves for a dye pot. And it was really lovely to bring that with me to Japan as a way of, even engaging with the craft centre there, and for them to know that was a local dye from where I come from, and having that conversation.
And they're two very different worlds, it seems.
Yeah.
The gold leaf, almost aristocratic world of Kanazawa, and the white brown land.
Absolutely, absolutely. I definitely had that sense, but it was, I guess it's those conversations you have through trying to understand each other. I don't speak Japanese, and luckily they spoke a little bit of English, but it was, the tension that you were talking about also of trying to, I haven't woven that much. I'm definitely not a practice person, so just, I think I spoke about in the article for Gala magazine, but just this beautiful gesture that the weaving instructor or the weaving leader of that studio, when I couldn't quite get it right, she just sort of pulled it ever so gently, and I got it, no words, just through that gesture. It was such a beautiful communication. It was lovely.
And I think it might be interesting to move on now to your work, Eva Abbinga, whose work in honour of the Raja quilt and the various stories that are attached to it. Your works, I've always been very interested in it, the fact that it is very material but also has a performance base and draws on your experiences in terms of belonging to a migrant community, the Ukrainian community, but with a strong commitment to country and to First Peoples here as well. And your work on the Raja quilt beautifully weaves all these elements together, but it's a story about connecting across time, it seems, that not just with the original convicts that made that quilt that came out to Australia, but also the communities that you worked with some of the quilting groups and guilds. How did you come across them? Was that your intention to begin with, or is it something that came out when you were trying to find a way of making it?
Yeah, well, it very much came out of the need to learn how to quilt. I came to the project with no knowledge of quilting at all, other than the fact that someone had given me a quilt for my child. So I had to learn quilting from scratch, and I'd had just moved to Geelong, so decided to join the Patchwork and Quilters Guild as a way of learning how to quilt. And it just turned out that I turned up to this quilting guild, and it was in a Masonic hall, and I opened the door and there was 150 people sitting at trestle tables, all sharing stories, teaching each other, working on their individual projects. And it was a real, it was like hitting a jackpot. I just felt like this was this moment of connectivity that I just stumbled across, this group that could pass on the knowledge that I needed. So I had a resource there that I could depend on. But I also relied heavily on the original Raja quilt as the guiding principle for how to make decisions on how to make the work. So, for instance, there was the age of the original Raja quilters was between 16 and 60. So I had this sort of guidance of what kind of a demographic of people I was aiming for to interact with. And so I went in there thinking, okay, I want to work with people across generations. I want to work with people who have never quilted before, to advanced quilters who had a lot of resource behind them and knowledge, and really bring all those people together in some form. So it was very much informed by the historic quilt as the kind of starting point, and it all kind of grew from there. And I guess does that answer your question?
Oh yes, I know your work does have. I mean, it's very in the world in the way you engage. I remember being part of one of your workshops, I think, doing embroidery as well at RMIT, and I think it's interesting that you're not just there in your studio, you're working with these particular groups. What was the way in which they responded to the work? Did they follow?
It was really beautiful to see some people really connect to the individual stories of the convicts. So each of the 36 patterns of the quilts was given a name of the original convicts. So each person that had a kit of quilts that they worked with could connect directly with an individual person that then some of them went off and researched. And I got 5 pages of documentation on one of the ladies who had really connected with that story of the original convict and really brought that to the work. So she'd embedded all her little embroideries, had stories about this lady's life that she'd sort of dug up from, I'm not sure where, like the State Library, I think. And so there was quite a bit of knowledge out there about the convicts that was there that just needed to be tapped into. I think that was a real beauty, was that it sort of had a momentum to it that I didn't need to think too much. I just had to make the work, and through the making process, those connections were made, and those stories came out, and different people played different roles in the making of the whole work. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And you also include, perhaps ahead of your time, given the fact that they've become ubiquitous now, but you've included QR codes in your work.
That's my own interest in the way that technology is related to textiles as well, in being a mathematical process, and I guess I was just interested in really bringing home that idea of embedding stories that related directly to the women, that having layers of, which is, beautiful, the idea that quilts are made up of layers of fabric, but then on top of that having layers of history that were brought into the actual quilt coverlet. That was just luck.
Well. Okay, back to you, David. It's interesting after hearing from Sara, Siri and Eva about the way in which in their practices they can use the craft of textiles to connect between nations through travel in different destinations across generations. Going back to the beginning where you oriented us in the string revolution, do you have any responses to the way in which these artists have presented their work?
Yes, I do. I think the architectonic of it all is connectivity. And it's not just connectivity within the weaving itself, it's connectivity in the sense of how we make consistencies in the world, how we create memories and understandings, how we create knowledge between people, practices, places, and a surrounding environment. And I think the fundamental problem that we've alluded to about representationalism is that we have come to believe that there's a separation. There's a world out there, and we can make representations of it, rather than seeing it as an engagement with that world, a performative, processual understanding, which actually produces the world that we live in. And we have an opportunity to change that form of essentially what Ingold calls hylomorphism. The idea that somehow or another, when you want to represent the world, you have an idea in your head and you make it happen. If you switch, as Ingold suggested, from thinking of weaving as a form of making, and so around making as a form of weaving, and that you don't, the thing about weaving is that you don't have this preconception in the head because it's performative. It comes out of what you actually do with your hands. It's an expression of the very point I was trying to make earlier about it being a living cognitive system. Everything's embodied. All our cognitive processes are embodied. We think it's all about language and words, and digitization and so on, but it isn't. It's embodied engagement with the world. And the way we make the world is in the process of weaving all its components, that I've already mentioned, into a narrative which makes sense of it. We're all in the meaning-making business, and the essential characteristic of meaning-making is weaving things together so that it all coheres. And string is only really a metaphor for all of that, but nonetheless it's the fundamental metaphor behind everything we talk about when we're talking about making sense. We are telling a yarn, we are following a thread, and on and on and on it goes. It's right through the discourse, but we've lost touch with that embodied sense of what it's really all about. And if we're going to have a new world, post-COVID, post-climate change, post-Trump, post all the disasters, post-Morrison, we're going to have to get back to the reality that we are in the process of creating the world. And the way you can see that is to look at these weavings and recognise them.
Thanks, David. It really does give this work the meaning and value that it deserves. I'm wondering if anyone has any other comment.
Yeah, I do, and I think I think I was looking at Ilka's work, and when you were talking about it earlier, and I was thinking about when I came in the car and that there was a spider trying to attach itself to the car, and my children were talking about how it's an inside spider and didn't know that it was an inside spider, and like the plastic being like, you know, oh, that's not like a rock or something like that. And then I was saying, oh yeah, it's an interesting website, isn't it? And so we started to talk about this sort of literal web that was happening in front of us and how tricky it was to work it out. And then I was thinking about what you were talking about, all this connectivity that happens with technology. And so I guess there are overlaps, even if it's it feels really removed a little bit, that technology. And I guess they're all technologies in the end as well.
Okay, we'll wrap it up. Good. Well, thank you so much. It's been a very stimulating conversation, and you know, as a curator, you often you enjoy the work and you make a selection and you talk to the artists to work out which work fits. But one of the pleasures of being with an exhibition is having the opportunity to learn more. Often there's so many layers that you're not even aware of, which is wonderful that you could share some of them, and that David could put things into this sort of broader perspective, both in terms of deep dive archaeology, but also the future and what's happening post-COVID and heading towards hopefully addressing climate change. Thank you so much for your time, and I just wanted to acknowledge the other artists who are part of this exhibition: Abude, Mary Burgess, Cresside, Collette, Valerie Kirk, whose beautiful tapestry is behind me, a lovely fossil, and Vicki Mason, Julie Raath, Shuklay, Tahpo, Susie, Vickery, Ilka White's work, of course, that's been here, and Liz Williamson, as well as Lee Durek, Sharon Peoples, Yunwes Perez, Munepo, Eloise Rapp, Abdullah Said, and Sara Waters, who hopefully will join the exhibition if we can get it to Canada, if the vaccines work. And I'd also like to thank Australian Tapestry Workshop. The exhibition will be here until Friday, February the 26th, 2021. And fortunately, it'll be online until the end of May 21. So I want to thank particularly Josephine and also the director of the Tapestry Workshop, Antonia Sine, and her team for helping to bring this work to Melbourne audiences. And I think one of the other things that also is strong for me in this show, and hopefully people outside Australia will see that that through textiles you can understand how the different skills of different communities related to our connection to the land can come together, that there's a sense of history, that there's also an acknowledgement of different cultures coexisting, that weaving is not a complete blending, that it's a way of bringing threads together so that they are in proximity with each other without one overwhelming the other, that these are elements that we should feel very proud of and very happy that our textile crafts in Australia are so vibrant. So thank you very much for both keep learning those skills, teaching them, but also presenting them in new ways. Thank you very much, and thank you for listening.